One of them has to do with a book that just came out quite recently, within I think the last month, called Capitalism for Realists. I think that we have a graphic of this book. Tibor Rutar, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Routledge. And I was really interested to see this book because I have been hearing for a little while now that it includes a response to something that I wrote a couple of years ago. So if you go back into the Wayback Machine to the late fall of 2021, if anybody here can remember that far, I was going to to this conference kind of thing at a university in Washington, D.C., where they basically, it was co-sponsored by the Mercatus Center, which is a libertarian think tank, and the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And basically, they invited me and another Jacobin kind of person and a couple of libertarians to spend the weekend on panels, discussing and arguing about things. And then there were like undergrads who'd applied to go to it. And it was all good fun. But while I was preparing for this, one of the things that I had to read to get ready for this was we all had a chance to sort of throw in readings that everybody else had to do. And one of the readings the libertarians suggested was this paper by this guy, Peter Leeson, called Two Cheers for Capitalism, which I believe there we go. We've also got a graphic of. And the basic thesis of this paper is that a lot of people, people who are just entirely too squishy about this stuff will say, now, maybe Two Cheers for Capitalism, it does a lot of good stuff, but there are some drawbacks, and and its sort of worst excesses need to be tamed and so on. But Leeson will have none of this. Capitalism deserves 3 cheers. And the primary evidence that's been appealed to for saying that capitalism deserves 3 cheers is another libertarian think tank, the Fraser Institute, which when I first wrote about them, I was spelling it F-R. Fraser. All right. I'll take your word for it.
This is the Kelsey Grammer Institute, right? Which I think would have similar politics, right? As the
exactly. That's the version on the American side of the border. Okay, but the Fraser Institute is the Western Canadian libertarian think tank. So I know them well.
Well, not only was it pronounced Fraser in my head, but when I was writing about it, the initial draft of the article I turned into Jacobin consistently spelled it like Dr. Crane's given name.
Nice.
But they have these economic freedom rankings that basically show that all of the good things are correlated with more economic freedom and all of the bad things are correlated with less economic freedom. And so I wrote about this for Jacobin, this article, Economic Freedom Rankings Don't Tell Us Anything About Capitalism. And part of what was in the Leeson article that inspired me to do this is that he makes this really, really interesting claim in the article that really jumped out at me. So I think we have the Leeson 1 graphic. So this paper is from 2005. It was an old paper, when I read it. And I want to remind you that it's 2005 because that means when he talks about a quarter century, the time frame is 1980 to 2005. Keep that in mind. So he says, although most countries became more capitalist over the past quarter century, not every country did. Many of the backsliders also enjoyed very high levels of economic freedom and backslid only minimally. For example, between 1980 and 2005, the United States became less capitalist by 0.09 points in Fraser's index. Now, I want to pause right there to say that the idea that this period that we're talking about, which is Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, is a period in which the United States became less capitalist. That's, an odd claim on the face of it. think about the policies of those four people. I think you're muted, Andy.
I'm just kind of shocked at the thinking about this idea of us backsliding when it's Saint Ronald Reagan, the savior of the free world, who free marketed us to freedom and liberty.
Yeah, I mean that was always my understanding of what happened, and even the only Democratic president in that time frame, 1980 to 2005, was Bill Clinton, who gave us NAFTA, GATT, WTO,
repeal of Glass-Steagall.
Repeal Glass-Steagall, exactly right. So, all of these things would not make me think that libertarians would think of this as a time frame in which the United States was becoming less economically free. But the real doozy is still coming, because says at the end of that, right? So, but it remained. Go to the next graphic. Okay, so it remained relatively capitalist. That's what they're saying. We're skipping ahead a few paragraphs. All right. Think of this as a little pop quiz. I'm really curious, which is the country name that pops out to you from this list? Fortunately, only 5 countries became significantly less capitalist over the last quarter century, when most everyone else was busy reaping the rewards of becoming more capitalist. So the last quarter century, I just want to remind you, is 1980 to 2005. These countries are Myanmar, Rwanda, Ukraine, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe. Each of these countries lost more than 1 point of economic freedom over the period on Fraser's 10-point scale. Fraser's 10-point scale. This decline translates into a 20 to 40% loss of economic freedom, depending on the country one considers. Okay, so, all right, Myanmar, Rwanda, even Zimbabwe. I mean, Zimbabwe, I guess I'm aware of some of the land reform issues and all of that. Myanmar and Rwanda, I would not comment on their economic systems. I just know too little about this. Venezuela is okay. I think it's fucking stupid that it plays the role that it does in the right-wing imagination on this question, considering that even at the height of Hugo Chavez's welfare state, it had a smaller public sector than France, but whatever, put that aside. Ukraine? The Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in 1980 was more capitalist than Ukraine in 2005?
That's amazing.
Obviously, they didn't actually start counting in 1980. However, it actually suggests something more questionable, which is the free fall, the collapse state of utter ruin at the end of the USSR, where all of a sudden production chains that had previously been seamlessly incorporated now crossed 3 international borders because the cotton was from Uzbekistan, the mill is in Russia, and the clothing factories in Estonia, right? You have utter dislocation, collapsing currency, people peddling whatever they have on the streets. And that is the glory days of economic freedom that we pine for, right? Oh no, we lost 40% of that bounteous freedom of universal starvation on the sidewalk. And now we're in the bad days, right? There's a kind of arbitrariness to these numbers, and in extremis, you're talking about collapsed systems that have their own individual characteristics, and you can't lump them together because it matters more about what informal networks are keeping people alive or what the particular diktat and planning system is maintaining what are basically wartime economies in all of these countries. Instead, you just have, oh, this is bad. Look at Zimbabwe, look at Venezuela, tisk, tisk, tut, tut.
Yeah, so in a Jacobin article, one of the main points that I was making, and I didn't even actually use the Ukraine example from Lisa, as astonishing as that was, in the article, because I couldn't reconstruct exactly what he was looking at, and I just, out of an abundance of caution, I just left it out, even though that the sort of amazingness of that claim was what first sort of, got the eyebrows lifting. But in the article, I do point out that there's a lot of very odd things about this list. That if you go to the Fraser's website, they have this interactive map you can play with that will show you where different countries are in the world. Yeah, so these are the criteria they use. Area 1, size of government. Area 2, legal and property rights. Area 3, sound money, which basically means there's a low inflation rate. Area 4, freedom to trade internationally. Area 5, regulation. And then, okay, so in a general sense, these are the criteria they use, but they have this interactive map that you can play with that'll show you where different countries in the world are and comparisons between them and all of that. And one of the things I quickly saw there is that Norway and Sweden tie for the title of the 37th most capitalist, most neoliberal, most economically free countries in the world. And Haiti is 155 or something. So the claim that Norway and Sweden are significantly, more capitalist, less socialist than Haiti, is very odd, right? That the, talk about Norway, for example, there's a huge, I think a larger, portion of the GDP is in state hands than in China. Because the giant state-owned oil company, or mostly state-owned oil company, obviously these places have, enormous wealth.
Sovereign wealth funds.
Yeah, exactly right. So something seemed very odd here, and basically the more I dug into it, the more it seemed to me that, once you sort of start looking at the subcategories and these broad categories, I think this is already obvious in the sound money one, but I think a lot of the other cases, you start looking at the subcategories, and it becomes very obvious very quickly that they're sort of that they're throwing in a lot of stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with what anybody's deploying these rankings to try to prove, because they're not really anything that's at issue in arguments between socialists or or supporters of capitalism, or between social democrats and libertarians. It's not if there's a lot of lawlessness and corruption, they'll count that as more capitalist because you need robust rule of law to have effective markets. It's okay, wait a second.
Yeah, exactly. They're just sneaking in a whole bunch of standard issue good governance into their definition of capitalism, which makes it very easy for them to then have the conclusion that look at how capitalism is associated with good governance.
Yeah, exactly. So what they're doing pretty consistently is they're counting countries. The more good outcomes a country has, the more capitalist they're counting it as, and then they're concluding that voila, capitalism is correlated with all these good outcomes. And that's sort of a not very interesting trick. And in fact, even if you look at the if you go back to that graphic we just had with the 5 criteria on it, that the one that sounds the one from their website, that the one that sounds the most like it's actually going to have something to do with capitalism and socialism is the legal system and property rights. Hey, property rights is in there. Now we're talking, right? And I dig into this in the article. So one of the things that that I say in the article is, well, hold on. You break down within that legal system of property rights, and you get all these subcategories: judicial independence, impartial courts, protection of property rights, military interference, rule of law in politics. Something socialists love. Ask Salvador Allende. Integrity of the legal system, legal enforcement of contracts, regulatory costs and sales of real property, and reliability of police. Now, again, as Kuba just said, almost all of these are just good government things that have absolutely nothing to do with anything that's really a dispute in capitalism versus socialism arguments. And so one of the things that I say in the article is that I say of these 8 categories, C, that's the one about property rights, is the only one that sounds remotely relevant to the capitalism versus socialism debate. And even there, it's only relevant if that property is being protected. What property is being protected for is nationalization or expropriation by the workers themselves, as in Argentina's recovered factory movement in the early 2000s. At a stretch, G might also be salient, although the regulatory costs socialists want to impose on businesses, like better workplace safety laws, a higher minimum wage, measures to make it harder to bust unions, rarely have much to do with the sale of businesses. Reading this, I think I was being like way too generous. I was stretching over backwards trying to give them a second one to say it was like halfway relevant, but really, like, regulatory costs of selling businesses has nothing to do with anything. Really, the only thing on this entire list that has anything to do with capitalism versus socialism is C, protection of property rights. But again, remember the point that I'm making in the Jacobin article is I don't say, oh yeah, C is clearly relevant to capitalism socialism. I say it's the only one that sounds remotely relevant to the capitalism socialism debate. And even there, it's only relevant if what property is being protected from is nationalization or expropriation by the workers themselves. So the reason I'm belaboring this is that when I actually looked with great excitement after all these months of being told by people like Chris Wright, who's a libertarian professor I'll argue with on Twitter, that this book contains a refutation of this Jacobin article in response to this criticism of the Fraser methodology. Well, here's what it actually says. It says that to neoliberal, so he's going off the Fraser numbers. He says, to conclude, neoliberalism, defined as increasing or high rates of economic freedom, tends to be directly or at least indirectly associated with many positive social outcomes, both correlationally and causally, although there are a few plausible negatives as well. Does this settle, at least in rough terms, neoliberalism's overall social performance? Says not necessarily. The problem with the assessment I've presented above could be that not everyone agrees with the proposed method of measuring neoliberalism. Writing for the popular Marxist journal Jacobin, Ben Burgis argues that one should not conflate Fraser Institute's Economic Freedom Index with how capitalistic, or for our purposes, neoliberal a country is. For him, a big concern is... okay, so it's ahead a little bit, says, so I think this is, again, like a couple paragraphs later. So a little bit cut off here, but it says, that like a bunch of these metrics don't seem to have anything to do with how capitalistic a given country's set of economic institutions is. He says there are conceptual problems with Burgess's critique. By the way, the reader is left guessing about what the conceptual problems are. I mean, this is a book. The guy's got space. He could have devoted as many pages as he wanted to. It's not, it's not like, oh, is Ulysses linked already. The publisher was telling him that, he had to cut it down, or, they just couldn't afford him as much paper. It's like a perfectly reasonably linked book. He could have spent a couple pages telling us what the conceptual problems are. He does not. But let us, for the sake of argument, it still does not necessarily follow from his critique that the Economic Freedom Index becomes useless. Instead, we have to examine whether it in fact does so. For instance, we can look at how the relative standards of particular countries change were we to recalculate the index by eschewing the access to sound money category and 7 of the 8 subcategories, the legal structure and property rights area, due to their alleged irrelevance to capitalism. And basically he concludes, hey, you just look at protection of property rights and, and it's still, all the good things are still correlated with that, and all the bad things are still correlated with the lack of it. But, I mean, you just saw what it said in the article. I didn't say, oh yeah, this one's totally legit. I said it's the only one that sounds remotely relevant. But even there, it would only be relevant if the thing property rights were being protected against was nationalization or, expropriation by the workers, which, to spell this point out, in 99.99999% of real cases, socialist revolutions being rare things in world history, is not what any measure of property rights is about, right? It's about stuff like, protection against crime, or protection against just like, corrupt officials, who are hurting their enemies and helping their friends, and and all that stuff. So again, I don't know, man. I think I want to believe that the Canadians could do better than this. It's a lovely country.
Don't forget, these are Albertans for the most part.
Okay.
Canada is not a monolith, Ben.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.